All right, we are back in the FITSNews studios for another edition of Your Week in Review. I am Will Folks, the owner, the founding editor of this media outlet. A lot to cover this week, and we're going to start with whatever happened to my eye here. Yeah, got kind of a nasty shiner. Apparently the story of getting decleated by a playground slide doesn't really sell, so I guess we're, in absence of the truth, we'll come up with something more interesting over the course of the show to explain this black eye. But at any rate, glad that you've joined us this week. A ton to cover. Before we dive into the substance of a historic week in Washington, D.C. and here on the Palmetto political front, I wanted to provide a quick update on some stories that we've been covering here in South Carolina. First, down in North Charleston, the escalation of a federal investigation into corruption, allegedly among several leaders in South Carolina's third largest city down there, just north of Charleston, South Carolina. This is a story we've been covering for many months. It involves an investigation led by federal agents into allegations of corruption. It initiated with a saga over $1.3 million in federal gun grants. These were grants that were intended to reduce gun violence in the city of North Charleston. They went to a network of nonprofits. That process has come under significant scrutiny. And in fact, one of the individuals associated with those nonprofits, Marvin Pendarvis, a former state lawmaker, has since resigned his office in connection with another scandal. So just a ton of different threads there. But as this investigation unfolded and expanded, it began entering into new areas. There's a huge component of it that is reportedly tied to a project between the Charleston County Parks, North Charleston, and a company called Sea Fox Boats out of Charleston. Now, this was a huge park that was planned for the Charleston area, but the plug was pulled on it when it was revealed that a manufacturing facility on the property would have created some fiberglass cuttings that apparently would have caused damage to the water there. But the project was scrapped, and a huge war erupted between the leader of Sea Fox Boats, an individual by the name of Freddie Rankin, and certain members of North Charleston government. That's part of the investigation, we're told. There are also allegations that an insurance reserve fund payout made with the support of certain city officials is part of the scandal as well. And one of the key players, as we reported earlier this week, North Charleston Councilman Jerome Hayward, has reportedly provided significant information and evidence to federal prosecutors and investigators as they dig into this scandal. So just a huge scandal in North Charleston that is spanning multiple different fronts. We've been on it from the very beginning, and in the event there are indictments related to that, we will bring them to you as soon as we hear the news. But again, from what we're told, every time investigators and prosecutors pick up one rock, they discover a new scandal to investigate. So significant public corruption in North Charleston, if our sources are to be believed. Now, state law enforcement division agents also on this case. We're not sure exactly what role they play, but they are supporting the federal investigation in North Charleston. Now, going to the other end of the state, we also had some big news this week about an upstate insurance benefits firm, IAG. This is a company in downtown Greenville, South Carolina, employs nearly 100 people. We heard reports last month that this company was having issues making payroll and that some of its employees had said they were denied payments that they were entitled to. Now, several of them filed suit in 2024 related to the denial of these payments. Now, since then, we have uncovered numerous lawsuits filed against IAG and its leader, Jay Dye, an individual who is very closely connected to several political leaders in the Palmetto State, including Governor Henry McMaster, just a very influential individual up there in the South Carolina upstate. But Dye sent an email to employees a week ago, January 17, saying that the company was shutting down, that they were not to come to work, and that they were not going to be able to be paid. Again, this was without any prior notice. And so this story has erupted over the last few days. FITSNews published our first report on it earlier this week. I want to credit WYFF television up in the upstate Greenville-Spartanburg for breaking the story. But we are digging deep into this saga, going through court records, going through all the information that we've been provided by our network of sources up there. So look for extensive coverage on the IAG scandal up in Greenville, South Carolina. So with those updates covered, On to the show. And a historic week in Washington, I'm going to sit down with Dylan Nolan to discuss Trump 2.0. Former President Donald Trump is now President Donald Trump again. The 47th President of the United States took office with a literal vengeance this past week, a flurry of executive action unfolding just moments after he was sworn in at the U.S. Capitol. Dylan and I are going to touch on some of the big issues while also diving into major developments in the Palmetto political scene, which again plays a huge role every 4 years in picking the president. I'm also going to sit down with our Jen Wood to discuss a boating tragedy that has sparked calls for reform of the way law enforcement agencies in South Carolina handle accidents on the water. It's a terrible story. Jen and I are going to explain what happened and what a family is doing to make sure it doesn't happen again. All of that and more coming your way on the Week in Review. So we're starting our show with a truly historic week in Washington, D.C. It's said that elections have consequences. And if you're a part of the deep state, a woke bureaucrat, or an illegal alien roaming the country, you're learning that this week, folks, as Trump 2.0 soared into Washington, D.C. with a flurry of executive action. You've heard about the 100 days of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Well, the 100 hours of Donald Trump, the first few days of his administration, have been an absolute barrage of executive action. Dylan, he's running on promises made, promises kept. We're going to talk about that. But first, before we start, Dylan, you got a theory on this black eye here?
Well, Will, I thought I wasn't supposed to talk about the FITSNews Fight Club.
Well, nobody's buying the official explanation. I mean, literally running into a slide on the playground with your kids. Is that hard to believe?
I'm just glad you're not trying to sell this story in a court of law, because I don't know if that would hold up.
Well, the funniest theory I heard was that I forgot the safe word with Katrina. So
I don't want to get into that.
Well, let's get into what's happening in our nation's capital, Dylan. The first term of Donald Trump, a lot of folks argued that he came in unprepared, that he had Republicans working actively against him, had no real mandate. That's not happening this time, is it? We've seen a very decisive chief executive during the first week of the Trump administration. Walk us through, Dylan, some of the highlights.
Yeah, I prepared articles on both his response to the border, as well as what's going to happen when the Ukrainian conflict assumedly gets settled at the negotiating table here. I would like to start with the border. I think that his designation of the cartels in Mexico as foreign terrorist organizations is perhaps the biggest gloves-off moment. We've been hearing his border czar, Tom Homan, say in a number of interviews leading up to the beginning of this administration that the gloves were coming off. And by designating these organizations as foreign terrorists, he could go in there and do what we've been seeing our government do to folks all throughout the Middle East here for the last 20 years, to these folks in Mexico who are, of course, sending fentanyl over a border that kills close to 100,000. Some may say even close to 250,000 people every year. Now, that would obviously come with consequences of retaliatory violence in the United States, but it means that he has the legal authority to take military action on this continent that we've not seen an American president do in decades. It also means that there will be civil and criminal penalties for companies in America that do business with these cartels. He's, of course, also taken his executive authority to begin immediate deportation operations in significant numbers of individuals accused of crimes or individuals convicted of crimes here in the United States. He's shut down the Border One app, which was allowing folks who wanted to come into America legally to literally schedule a time to do so. So yes, he's taken a lot of executive actions.
Sent National Guard troops down to the border.
Sent 1,500 troops, preparing potentially to deploy 10,000. He declared this a national emergency, which allows the military to prepare for this in a completely different way. There's reports that they're going down there as if they're going to war. You know, they're ready to treat this in a completely different way. So that is something that, as you say, in the first 100 hours is different. There is one thing I thought it was very interesting that in your intro you brought up FDR. And his 100 days were monumental because he did this in concert with the legislature, in concert with the courts. That is not something we're seeing with Trump here. We're seeing pushback on his nominees by intransigent members of his own party in the Senate. He definitely does not have the same grip over the House that FDR had. And FDR completely, I think, inappropriately browbeat the courts into submission by threatening to, basically eradicate them by adding a bunch of new members. Packing. Yes, pack the courts, something the Democrats were talking about doing very recently. I don't hear them talking about that anymore. Well, maybe we should pack the courts.
Interesting.
I think his first 100 days are going to be filled with executive action that unfortunately will be able to be rolled back as soon as a Democrat is back in office. For us to have that transformative change that lasts for generations, as we've seen FDR was able to do, that takes the legislature working with them.
Yeah. Well, we talked a lot during the recently concluded presidential race about the issue of immigration, how central it was to voters. Also, the economy, I would argue, was the biggest issue. But when you look at Trump's executive actions and when you look at what the legislature's been doing since coming back to Washington earlier this month, they passed the Lake and Riley Act, which is a big deal
Bipartisanly.
but yeah, with a lot of Democrat support, which again, you wouldn't have seen that a couple of years ago. But so you do see some legislative support for some of these core issues that Trump is pushing on. I don't know if the legislature is going to go quite as far as he wants to go. A perfect example of this, though, birthright citizenship. This is the argument that if you enter the country illegally and have a baby, that child is a citizen. And according to
Or even if you're a tourist here.
correct, yeah, absolutely. And so Trump has rescinded that via executive order. There is a bill that has been introduced. I think it's a congressman from Alabama introduced it that would outlaw it legislatively, statutorily. The argument from the Democrats is that you can't do either of those things, that it is a constitutional protection and that has to be overturned through a constitutional amendment. So how all that plays out, we're going to see. But one thing I've heard, Dylan, I've talked to a couple folks working the border in the aftermath of these decisions by Trump. We are already seeing the effect when it comes to folks deciding whether or not to try and come in. And I'm not just talking about the southern border. Up in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, mass migration has occurred on those borders over the last few years. But we are seeing that steady stream literally come to a halt. It's like turning off a faucet, one of the agents up there told me this week, turning off a faucet. So I think you're taking away a lot of the incentive for folks to come here, Dylan. That's a big part of it too.
Certainly. And I mean, I'm going to display on the screen right now a graphic that is in one of my articles we published this week that shows the levels of known migrants who came to this country illegally under 4 years of Joe Biden's first term and 4 years of Donald Trump's first term. You can see the dramatic effects that actually enforcing border policy has on the number of folks that come in. If you're just listening to this as a podcast, each year the numbers fluctuate a little bit, but it's about 1/5 as many people who are known to have come into this country illegally under each of the 4 years of Trump as there were under Biden.
Wow. And again, we saw it firsthand back in 2023. We took a trip down to the border, spoke with folks who discussed that at one point, referring to Trump's first administration, they had operational control of the border. And clearly they did not during the administration of Joe Biden. In fact, we passed one of those depots with all the wall building material sitting there that had been stuck.
That was before Joe Biden put it up on eBay to auction it off for pennies on the dollar.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. We talked about the border. What else did Trump hit in this blizzard of executive action to start his term?
It's interesting. I don't know if you remember Steve Bannon, obviously, as a strategist in his first term. He has this phrase for a strategy, which is called flooding the zone. And that means not giving the liberal media something that they can hold their teeth on for more than an hour at a time. So he just hit them with executive order after executive order after executive order. I'd like to zone in on the DEI executive order because this is something that I wrote about extensively a couple of years ago. DEI is something that ingrains hiring on the basis of race and sex into companies, into government bureaucracies. And it's something that, while I think it has good motivations in that it wants to help people who may or may not be from marginalized groups, historically marginalized groups, necessarily this is something that is going to hurt somebody else. And somebody who had no, if you're a smart Asian kid, say, you have no choice that you were born Chinese, but you're gonna have a much harder time getting into college because of programs like this. So these are programs that are immensely unpopular with members of the Republican Party and with a growing number of independents and even people in the Democrat Party. So immediately striking that down. On a similar vein, ending affirmative action within the federal government hiring process. This is something that was put in place by LBJ in the 60s. So we talk about unrolling some of these FDR policies, having his own 100 days of coming in here and really changing the way that our government works. There is a lot of talk of unrolling these policies, which were implemented in the 60s, that changed the way that America functions. And I think we're seeing a lot of that.
And what's amazing is you look at the public opinion support for Trump in the aftermath of his...
the highest it's ever been.
And it's also noteworthy that that support is cross-sectional. You've got overwhelming Black support, overwhelming Hispanic support. These are constituencies which have not supported Republican presidents in the past. They're supporting Trump on this.
Male support, female support, equal. This is truly historic, and there's nothing like what we saw in 2016.
So let's look forward. You've also been covering how Trump's policy toward Ukraine could play out. Obviously, there was major development prior to him taking office with the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, but also Trump's focus on Ukraine and perhaps sitting down with Vladimir Putin in the next few weeks. Where does that conflict stand, Dylan? What does Trump's inauguration mean for the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's interesting to think, how is Trump going to approach these negotiations? Because of course he ran on not being a hawk on this issue. So it's kind of tough to come and sit down with somebody and bargain for one side of the deal when you've already said publicly, I don't really care about the outcome of this. So what Trump is doing, setting the tone here, is saying, I'm going to back these Ukrainians so that I can actually get a decent deal here. To that end, he paused foreign aid to all of the nations that we were dispensing it to, except for two: Israel, because, Israel and
Runs our government.
they own our country, and Ukraine, because he needs to have leverage here.
Right.
And so he's also issued a threat that if there's not an acceptable deal agreed to within 100 days, he's going to ratchet up the sanctions. And Trump, he's bellicose, he's unpredictable. So I think he wants to keep Putin's allies, the CCP, on their toes. Not sure whether he is going to up the ante in this war, despite having run on ending the war, or actually bring it to a close.
Well, also some other announcements. The Gulf of America is now in effect. Down in the Gulf Coast, we've got Mount McKinley back. And of course, Trump signing an executive order earlier this week instructing the release of the assassination files regarding JFK, RFK, and MLK. So we will see what the government has been keeping under wraps all these years. I'm not sure people would keep stuff that would incriminate them, but anyway, we'll find out. Hopefully once those records are released, Dylan, but clearly a slew of action from Trump. I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the state of South Carolina, obviously pivotal to Trump's ascension. His first in the South victory in 2016 paved the way to his securing of the Republican nomination the first time he ran. South Carolina, obviously a huge state for him. In this last election, he crushed former Governor Nikki Haley in her own state, 60-40. It was a MAGA massacre of the neocon movement under Nikki Haley. But as South Carolina goes, Dylan, so goes the country. And as the first in the nation for Democrats, remember Joe Biden, he won his nomination 4 years ago because of South Carolina, such a pivotal state. But there are some interesting dynamics at play in South Carolina. We talked on this show about how Trump pivoted, in many cases, away from social issues, away from the issue of abortion, softened the GOP stance on that, and that helped him, arguably, in the last election cycle. But in South Carolina, we have seen a renewed surge in a state, again, where we already have a very tough abortion law, 6-week abortion law. Anything after 6 weeks, illegal. But there is a group of religious leaders, evangelical representatives, want to pass a total ban on abortion in South Carolina. They have a caucus 56 strong. They have a bill introduced with 36 co-sponsors. Dylan, how are we still talking about abortion in South Carolina? This issue was settled a few years ago, wasn't it?
So yeah, you're referencing Representative John McCravey out of Greenwood's Family Caucus, which has grown in size and grown in strength here recently. And I think that one of the reasons that this has happened is we saw in the last Republican primary cycle, which I know that you have a running counter in your head of the days until the next Republican primary, because that's just how your brain works. But we saw in the last
17 months.
There we go. We saw in the last primary cycle that this is an issue that you can beat somebody in a primary on. So if you're somebody who's currently in the state house and you see that this is something that's coming up for discussion, I would certainly, if I'm a Republican running in a conservative district, be wary of not getting aboard the train. However, I think there's the leadership at the House, the leadership in the Senate, who have a lot of things that they want to try to get past this session that are not related to abortion, and they understand this will take up a lot of time, precious time.
Well, they want nothing to do with it.
Right, they want nothing to do with this. But I think that there's going to be a big push, and I think that there's going to be a lot of fear of being on the wrong side of this and getting absolutely clobbered in a primary, as we saw happen to multiple people.
And again, all this started back in 2022 when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, set the authority for determining abortion law, gave it back to the states, where I think it should have been all along, but we can argue that at a later date. But South Carolina took action. They passed a ban, a heartbeat bill. However, that was struck down by the state Supreme Court, had to go back to the drawing board. So basically, this dominated 2 or 3 legislative sessions. And I think leadership has said, look, we're done with this, but this family caucus is on the rise. They're adding to their ranks. And this is not just a a splinter group of, fringe lawmakers here. There are legislative leaders who are a part of this group. The minority leader, or I'm sorry, the majority leader in the House is a member of this group. Speaker Merle Smith reportedly inquiring as to becoming a member. This is a group that's got a lot of momentum at a time, Dylan, when nationally Republicans seem to be pivoting away from social issues.
Well, I think there's a huge difference in what should be pursued in Washington, D.C., and what should be pursued in the states. I mean, the federal model of government, the federalism means devolving power that needs to be at the state level down to the state level. Now, we've seen that bastardized over the history of this country with what I believe are bad Supreme Court rulings that have vested the federal government with a godlike level of authority and left the states to, try to pave the roads. But revesting through what I think are better Supreme Court rulings, the ability for these decisions to be made at the state level means that discussions that are inappropriate to be happening in Washington, D.C. are going to happen at the state level. So the idea that, the whole nation thinks one thing and that should dictate what we do in South Carolina, that's not how this is going to work.
Well, once again, it matters because of that starring role that South Carolina plays on the national political stage. I want to touch on another huge issue that's unfolding as the state's legislative session begins, and that's the issue of energy. South Carolina is a state that has seen huge population growth. We've seen a lot of industrial growth over the past few years. That hasn't necessarily translated into more jobs and more income level growth, but it has resulted in a need for massive amounts of new power. And we have struggled to meet that demand. During a winter storm a few years ago, the grid in the upstate nearly went down. The system was stretched to the max during the last recent winter storm we had. But Dylan, there's a push to reboot what would be a boon for energy here in South Carolina. That would be the VC Summer nuclear power plant. For those of you who haven't followed this, $9 billion was sunk into this plant, into the construction of two new state-of-the-art nuclear reactors, Westinghouse reactors. About 8 years ago, that project was abandoned. $9 billion in sunk costs. People are still paying for this here on their power bills in South Carolina. That's how expensive this project was. But State Senator Tom Davis, back at the time, pressed Santee Cooper, our state-owned utility, to preserve these assets. Davis argued at the time that while it's not feasible now, there may come a time in the future where these assets could prove valuable again. Well, guess what? We are now at that time, arguably. Davis had a bill this year which would have instructed Santee Cooper to submit requests for proposals regarding a reboot of this project. Now, Davis filed this bill, but rather than fight him on it, Santee Cooper decided, you know what, we're going to go ahead and launch that RFP. That happened this week, Dylan. So there is now, for the first time in 8 years, a real chance that we're going to build two nuclear reactors here in the Palmetto State.
Yeah, and let's put this in the context of what's happening in the nation. We just saw President Trump had a meeting with three of the biggest leaders in the AI industry globally who are going to be investing $500 billion in the United States in creating AI infrastructure here. And that involves creating data centers. And what do data centers need? A lot of power, to the point where some of them are actually going to have their own power generation on site. But there's a lot of interest in building these things in the Southeast because we're such a great place to build things. We have way less regulation than other places in the country. This is a state where you don't have to deal with unionized workers. So there's a lot of interest with these tech firms, including Google, in building facilities here. Now, say what you will about these firms. I think that folks should look at how this AI technology eventually ends up being used to put together a surveillance state that could, completely ruin freedom in America.
There's a few red flags here.
Yeah, right. Take that for what it is. But let's look at this as an energy issue. This is something that could lead to massive federal investment that could pay for these reactors to be developed in large part and finish the job here and potentially take it out of the hands of the morons in the state of South Carolina who completely bungled it the first time.
Indeed. Trump's orders also could pave the way for natural gas infrastructure expanding dramatically here in South Carolina and also connecting South Carolina, again, to assets like the Marcellus Shale. There have been pipeline plans that had been put on hold during the administration of Joe Biden. Trump firmly committed to reviving a lot of these America First energy proposals. So we're going to see a dramatic reshaping, Dylan, of this debate moving forward. As we think about the leaders who will be tasked with implementing a lot of these decisions and making a lot of these calls in the months and years to come, I did point out just a moment ago, we're 17 months away from Republican primary elections. You spoke just a moment ago about how that family caucus, freedom caucus, that connection could result in some severe
bloodshed in the primaries.
real bloodshed, and could shift the ideological composition of the legislature.
Certainly.
Obviously, we got a GOP supermajority in South Carolina in both the House and the Senate, and they have been trending more conservative in recent years. But this election cycle upcoming could see a big shift. But there's a bigger race, Dylan, to focus on, one which we saw some big news this week. Nancy Mace, 1st District Congresswoman from South Carolina. She has done nothing but win tough races over the last 6 years, first at the South Carolina State House level, and more recently defeating an incumbent to win her seat in the U.S. Congress and staving off multiple primary challengers, including one that was endorsed by Donald Trump, and one in the last cycle that was endorsed by the GOP establishment in Washington. Mace making it clear she is running for governor of South Carolina. And Dylan, the knives came out pretty quickly for her, didn't they?
They certainly did. And I think that you're referencing, folks, bringing back up a video of Nancy from yesteryear that is less than favorable.
Yes, the baby bird. In fact, why don't we just show this video? This is the clip that has drawn.
If you're eating lunch, folks, skip 30 seconds.
You might want to. Yeah, this is an interesting clip. We'll go ahead and preface it. It is called the Baby Bird Mama Bird video. It was from apparently 2015, filmed in a home in the upstate of South Carolina, which features Mace and a few friends having a party with some alcohol. Let's take a look. Dylan, obviously we don't do that here at FITSNews, and that's not how the black eye occurred. So no baby bird nor mama bird in here.
No blackout. Yes, black eye.
But here's the question. This clip has been circulated in every election that Nancy Mace has run in dating back to 2018, and no one has cared.
To that end, I'd love to pull a quote from her 2018 opponent, which I think, is about as succinct as one could describe this. She says Mace's immaturity, irresponsibility, and lack of fitness for public office are demonstrated in that video. But as you say, it's important to note, she still lost. Nancy Mace defeated her.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Nancy Mace has been, this clip has been released in 2020 in her congressional race, released in 2022, released in the last election. Nobody cares. You've got some polling on it, Dylan.
Oh, well, yeah, this is the FITSNews audience polling. And what I thought was interesting is at the time that I pulled these numbers, most of the people said, that this doesn't really affect them either way. There was a slim minority who said that this makes them less likely to support Nancy, but there were 7% of our readers who said it was making them more likely to support Nancy. And to those 7% of the FITSNews readers, Dylan at FITSNews.com, shoot me an email. I think you guys might be a good time.
These are the guys you want to party with.
But seriously, I think it's important that you mentioned this video was filmed in the upstate. When she's running a statewide election, this is different than beating somebody for a state house seat. She's going to have to appeal to these upstate voters, and that's a very socially conservative crowd. That's a very religious crowd. And I think it's somebody who might look at doing these kind of, drunken, debauched activities not too favorably.
You're right. This will be the first time she's running the upstate. And it was interesting. We actually interviewed the woman in the video, Elise Hemmerling. She is a career law enforcement military officer based in New York. We contacted her to get her thoughts on this video. She said she supported Mace 100%. She said, quote, "This is why good people don't run for office." It's interesting. That's language Mace has used on several occasions in responding to attacks against her. But this video, again, we're talking about it here, and people are probably wondering, well, why are we talking about it? Well, this was an exclusive story. Exclusive, I'm baby quoting here. The Daily Mail ran this in December, Dylan, as an international expose accusing Mace of being a bisexual. It was just a crazy article. There have been allegations related to that as well. Do you think that this is the end of this video? Do you think now that it's out, it's been discussed?
I think this video is going to be broken for the first time 10 years later again, because Nancy Mace just keeps growing her reach. So there's, increasing numbers of people who 6 months ago had never heard of Nancy Mace and are now hearing for the first time that she had some lesbian-appearing lady spitting liquor into her mouth.
Yeah, which again, as you mentioned, how that plays in the upstate, we'll
We will see.
We will have to see. Mace, the runaway frontrunner as it stands right now in the 2026 GOP gubernatorial campaign, she and Attorney General Alan Wilson head and shoulders ahead of the rest of the field, according to the early polling that we've seen. Now, there are multiple polls as we film this in the field related not only to that governor's race, but also polls testing Lindsey Graham, the incumbent U.S. Senator, whether or not he would be vulnerable to a challenge from either Mace, Alan Wilson, or former Lieutenant Governor Andre Bauer, who we talked about on the last show. So as soon as we get information on those polls, we'll be sure to bring them to our audience. But some consequential elections unfolding in South Carolina. Dylan, don't have to point it out to you that Nancy Mace's announcement that she was running for governor, or strongly considering it, made national news.
Certainly, it was reported in the Associated Press, which means it was blasted to every newspaper in the world.
Yeah, Politico picked up on it. A ton of national outlets really focused on it. So we're going to be following it very closely. I do want to point out that a week before that AP article came out,
it's not news to the FITSNews
Not
leadership.
news to FITSNews, because she gave a quote to us where she basically laid out that she was going to run. So very interesting developments politically. Dylan, what else we got Palmetto political-wise? Anything else on our radar this week?
I've been reporting on some judicial race drama within the State House. Of course, this news outlet has done a lot of coverage on how this state selects its judges. And then there's been an interesting debate going on in the South Carolina State House, chiefly driven by the York County delegation. There were two judicial candidates running for one of the circuit court seats up there. And one named Melissa Inzarello. She is the only candidate left on the ballot. Another, Jennifer Colton, who argues that she was unfairly, unfavorably reported on by the bar and basically pressured to drop her candidacy or have her career damaged. This is something that upset a lot of the GOP lawmakers up there who are pushing for behind closed doors for her candidacy to be dropped. They're pushing Inzarello to drop her candidacy because they feel as though Colton was not given a fair shake. And this is something we've heard a lot and reported a lot over the years on these kind of backdoor phone call deals to get candidates to drop their candidacy. Now, there's, I think, interesting arguments on both sides of the story. If the bar did come in here and inappropriately act to pressure her rival to drop out, then that is not something that is appropriate. At the same time, I've had a lot of folks who are on both sides of the political aisle who have practiced as defense attorneys, who have practiced as prosecutors, tell me that Inzarello is a woman of character, a hardworking attorney who would make a great judge. However, she is a career public defender, somebody who the defenders of public safety argue is not the type of person that York County wants on the bench, and they feel as though the way that this process was conducted leaves them with no option but to try to spike her candidacy. So at FITSNews, we try to have nuanced takes on these issues. As you can tell, this is not like a clear black and white, good guy, bad guy. I think there's arguments that are legitimate to be made on both sides here. But in providing this report this week, I really just wanted to bring transparency to this process, to let both sides make their arguments in public so that there's not just this one day this candidate drops out, nobody knows what happened. I think it's a lot better to do these things with the light of day shining upon them.
Well, you said it just a moment ago. I think when you said it's the way the process unfolded, and we keep hearing this over and over again. And you said it wasn't black and white this time. Well, guess what? Last year it was black and white. A very qualified black candidate for the judiciary was forced out of the race to pave the way for a former Democrat politician, James Smith. We exposed it. Republicans who were supporting Smith scurried for cover, and his nomination was defeated. So we'll see if this nomination is also defeated. But Dylan, we keep getting into these situations where lawmakers are playing political games with judicial appointments. And it goes back, for me anyway, as somebody who has been arguing for years now to fix the way we appoint judges in South Carolina. To me, it goes back to, again, that underlying need to have a better system of selecting judges, because the current one clearly every year creates scandals like this.
Yeah, and I think that, while we wanted to celebrate some of the judicial reforms that were passed last year, you were reticent to do that. You're reluctant to do that because it didn't really change the system. It made some tweaks, and I think that those tweaks were definitely improvements that closed some of the obvious doors to corruption. But like you say, without completely re-engineering the system, which I believe would take a constitutional amendment, so it would take significant political support. But we're going to continue to have inappropriate influence like this, and I think it's time that folks who are serious about picking judges in a way that invites less inappropriate political influence look at something like the federal system, and obviously we would have to modify it to fit our state. But I think that would be a great place to start, where the executive puts forth nominees and then they are moved through the legislature for confirmation.
Indeed. And you just mentioned it would take a constitutional amendment. You are absolutely right. That means 2/3 of both chambers. Well, guess what? The Republicans have those super majorities. So again, it goes back to
We have the votes if we have the political will. It's a
absolutely.
political will problem.
Absolutely. And until it's fixed, I would argue that we are going to continue to see issues of injustice in South Carolina regarding powerful lawyer legislators getting their friends on the bench, getting preferential decisions. And again, that's not good for public safety. That's not good for the integrity of the system.
And it's not good for the candidates either when you have somebody who's an otherwise qualified candidate who is now having a campaign run against them in the legislature because of the process that seemingly they had no input on.
Indeed. Well, this is an issue FITSNews has been on again from the beginning. We have been sounding the alarm on the injustice so pervasive in South Carolina's system for years. As we mentioned, there were some reforms to the process that passed last year, but a lot of work to be done, as evidenced by this latest scandal. Dylan, great reporting on it.
Thank you. And I'm going to be writing about this next week. I'm if Dylan at FITSNews.com, if you have information about this, if you would like to have your voice heard, I welcome folks who feel, in support of Inzarella. I welcome folks that don't want to see her on the bench. Reach out. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
And also, our microphone is open to those who have views on how the state should fix the justice system. We've articulated ours. I've argued for gubernatorial appointment, followed by retention elections, public elections, once those appointments are approved. So that's my view. But again, we open the mic to anybody with a perspective that will help advance that conversation, folks, because ultimately, advancing that conversation is going to be key to getting the real reforms that we need to get the accountability that you deserve. So, folks from around America are aware of South Carolina's pristine 187 miles of coastline. It's one of our big tourism draws as a state, with tens of thousands of visitors descending on our beaches each spring and summer. But South Carolina also has more than 30,000 miles of riverfront, numerous systems that drain into the Atlantic. We also have hundreds of thousands of acres of lake. In fact, Lake Marion alone, 110,000 acres, just a massive body of water. So not surprisingly, boating is a huge deal in South Carolina. There are hundreds of thousands of folks who have registered boats that enjoy our lakes, our rivers, and our coastline. But as you might imagine, in many cases, this love of boating often turns into tragedy, particularly when alcohol is involved and particularly when individuals are reckless in the operation of watercraft. Now, back in September of 2019, there was a huge collision on Lake Murray that our media outlet covered extensively. And in that case, alcohol was allegedly involved, but there was a controversial ruling which tossed that. However, the judge in that case, Heath Taylor, a circuit court judge, sentenced the defendant, Tracy Gordon, to 10 years in prison for homicide, reckless homicide via the operation of a watercraft. Now, that was big justice for the family of Stanley Kaiser, a 68-year-old from the Midlands region of South Carolina who died in that boat crash. By the way, his wife, Shawn Kaiser, also lost her leg in that tragic incident. We covered that case extensively. We covered that trial extensively. But about 8 months after the Kaiser's tragedy, another boating accident unfolded on the banks of the Congaree River in Richland County, South Carolina. And this was an incident which didn't generate quite as much press at the time, but in the last few years, thanks to our research director, Jen Wood, it has become a huge story. And in that case, again, allegations of negligent operation of a watercraft, which resulted in the death, in this case, of a young man named Jaden Phillips. And I've got a letter here. We were contacted earlier this year by Jaden's mother, and you can see the letter here, one of the handwritten letters. We get tragically, we get letters like this very often. And you can see she's got a picture here of her son, seeking truth for her son in connection with the story. And our Jen Wood did a big report on this, but so many questions from this case, the case of Jane Phillips. And I'm joined now by Jen Wood, who's going to walk us through some new developments in this case, in addition to walking us through what happened. But Jen, first, take us back to that spring night, back in 2020, when Jaden Phillips and his friends set off for a day of fun on the Congaree River. Tell us what happened.
So Jaden and his father, Shane Phillips, decided to spend the day with their friends on the river for his birthday. Congaree, I guess, has a lot of sandbars. So, they parked on sandbars, did, all the things guys do during the day.
Had a few beers, enjoyed the weather, yeah.
Just, I think, one of those beautiful May, South Carolina days. And Jaden was riding back to the landing in the evening on the boat of a 30-year-old. So Jaden was 19 at the time. The 30-year-old's name was Irvin Eckrott. And they, had another friend behind them in another boat. And according to the friend, the boat that Jaden was on, that Eckrott was driving, they were cutting the river. So, kind of going very fast, taking the boat to the edge of the river. And at some point, he lost sight of them. And according to the investigation, the boat, while it was cutting the river, had hit some tree branches. And that tree branch caused substantial injury to Jaden's head, front and back.
And when you say substantial, we're talking, almost immediately he's losing significant amounts of blood. He's having trouble breathing. But Jen, walk us through. So this horrific collision occurs with these trees. Did anyone other than those on the boat witness it, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
But this other boat comes around the corner and sees these trees, shaking, or there's evidence that there was a collision.
Right. And the guy on the boat behind him told the Irvin Eckrott, who's driving the boat, to call 911 and get to the boat landing. Mm-hmm. So they all proceed to go to the boat landing. Somebody's trying to get a hold of Jaden's dad, who was still back on the sandbar. To their knowledge, nobody called 911 until that boat arrived at the landing, and a bystander saw them pull in, saw Jaden laying in the back of the boat, bleeding profusely from his head, and he called 911.
So now they were fortunate when they get to the landing, and that one of the first folks there is a first responder, somebody who knows kind of what to do. So the 911 call is placed, and there is someone there who is administering aid to Jaden. But Jen, that's where the good fortune dried up, because all of a sudden you've got a jurisdictional mess, confusion over who responds to this. Walk us a little bit through some of the confusion that set in as that 911 call was placed.
Everything that could have gone wrong from the point that boat came to the landing, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And it's absolutely, like, this is one of those stories that's just stuck with me as a mother. Where the boat landing is located is right on the border of Calhoun County, Orangeburg County, Lexington County, Richland County. And the 911 call was bouncing around while dispatch operators were trying to figure out who had jurisdiction. When they finally determined that the accident occurred in Richland County, the ambulance driver struggled to find the boat landing. With head injuries, seconds count. So, these delays are just, they're inexcusable.
Well, Jen, there's another layer of this too. You talked about all the different counties that kind of converge on this one point, which is really, if you've been over this bridge, it's the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's a very wooded, secluded part of the state, south of Columbia, South Carolina, sort of toward the end of the Congaree National Forest area. But it's an area where, again, there's not, it's very remote. But you talked about the jurisdictional confusion, but there was also confusion regarding where the incident took place, as far as on the water or off the water, because if it's an incident on the water, that is the purview of the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And we mentioned earlier all these hundreds of thousands of acres of lake land, lake property. We mentioned all these tens of thousands of miles of rivers. That's a huge jurisdiction, and DNR has jurisdiction over all those. Am I correct?
Yes, they do. Except for, or if you get to the coast, the Coast Guard does. But yes, the waterways in the state, DNR has jurisdiction. Now, there was a dispatch, a separate call from dispatch to DNR notifying them of a crash. But it's unknown whether or not they knew the incident had occurred on the water. So it's another huge delay and caused problems in the investigatory process.
So there's no indication of which county it's in initially. There's no indication of whether it's going to be a water-based incident that DNR would investigate. So there's just mass confusion every which way. There's late arrival of 911 in terms of the emergency response. And then didn't you mention that in a case like this where there's this significant of an injury, 911 and emergency responders are supposed to bring a crew of 3, I believe. And they were
Correct.
originally only dispatched a crew of 2, which
Correct.
further
Or they had
what
to
a
wait
mess.
for another EMT to respond to help.
So for 4 days, Jaden is in the hospital. He's on life support. And after 4 days, his family makes I couldn't even imagine that kind of decision, but they decide at that point to terminate the life support. And Jaden died 4 days after this crash, correct?
Yes.
So Jen, obviously, a case like this, we just talked about the Kaiser case from 2019 and how there was accountability in that case. There was an investigation. There were breathalyzers, things of that nature. What happened in this case?
So Richland County Sheriff's Department was the responding agency, and the Deputy Bergman, who responded to the scene, um, did not ask the driver's name or inquire if he had had anything to drink, despite a
According to
crowd.
a civil lawsuit, though, correct?
Yes,
This is
these are
per.
according. Yes,
All right.
and that's despite a crowd telling him at the scene that members of the party had been consuming alcohol. There's no field sobriety test done. No, I mean there was no investigation as to whether or not this accident was alcohol related.
So the driver of the boat that Jaden was on at the time it struck these trees, or what we believe happened, no charges filed against him,
No,
but he had a previous boating under the influence. Is that
yeah.
accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Whew. So walk us through, Jen. When you first published this, I think a lot of folks were like, "Are you kidding me? How was this not more thoroughly investigated?" Again, based on what that civil suit alleged. But this year, as state lawmakers have come back to Columbia, one of them has introduced a bill which seeks to standardize the process by which similar incidents in the future would be investigated. And you did a story, Jen, this week on that bill. Walk us through what is being proposed and how the sponsors think it would help events like this in the future.
Yeah, it's one of those bills where you read through it and you're like, this just makes sense. It's they would like to call it Jaden's Law after Jaden. And one of the first things in that law, it would require 911 dispatchers to provide all law enforcement agencies, EMT providers, first responders, the physical address and GPS coordinates for all public boat landings. It's also going to require SCDNR to identify the boat landings with visible signs facing both directions at their entrances. So that would prevent further delays in response.
Okay, and it would also standardize the DNR reaction or how DNR would be involved and notified. Is that correct?
Right. So it would also require 911 dispatchers to ask callers if an accident victim had sustained injuries while on a body of water. If the answer is yes, then the dispatcher is required to direct SCDNR to respond to the call.
Jim, we see in South Carolina, obviously, it's not one of the bigger states in terms of its size. It's, I believe, the 40th in terms of its size, but South Carolina has a ton of local, municipal, county jurisdictions, 46 counties in South Carolina. Again, tons of municipal jurisdictions, and then obviously the overlay in this case, because of the water-based nature of it, the overlay of the State Department of Natural Resources. So confusion often plays a role in this case, and Jen, too often we see it playing a role that doesn't lend itself toward justice, that doesn't lend itself toward accountability and outcomes. And I wanted to just kind of read real quick one of the paragraphs from Jaden's mom's letter to us when they first started pushing this legislation. As she wrote, "There is no surrender in a mother's heart. We continue to pursue truth and accountability regarding the death of our only son, 19-year-old Jaden Phillips. Together, we must face the facts in an effort to change the fractures that failed our son. This cannot happen again. And if injustice and evil are allowed to continue, it will not be because we remained silent nor complicit." And again, this letter, again, from Jaden's family in the aftermath of this tragedy. Jen, amazing work on this on your part. But as we look at this story, obviously, given the prevalence of boating culture in South Carolina, and again, who doesn't have a beer or two when they're out on the water? I mean, I think that's pretty standard. But my goodness, when you're dealing with situations like this, and there's got to be a standardized investigative procedure that's followed in the
Right.
aftermath.
And boating accidents, I actually worked as a marine safety officer in college. It's a very specialized investigation. It requires a lot of knowledge that's very different from investigating an accident on the roadway. There's no lanes of travel. There's no seatbelts. The physics are different. Evidence is more difficult to preserve because you are on a waterway. So it requires a very specialized type of investigation to do it correctly.
Well, we are going to monitor the status of Jaden's law as it makes its way through the South Carolina General Assembly. In fact, I spoke earlier this week with Morgan Kaiser, the daughter of the late Stanley Kaiser. We spoke about his case earlier this year. Morgan was a huge advocate for boater safety at the South Carolina State House. In the aftermath of her father's death, she has been pushing legislation, pushing accountability and justice in her dad's case. She told me she is on this case. So a real big ally there for those who are going to be advancing Jaden's law at the South Carolina State House. So we will keep our audience in the loop as that case moves forward. But also just a reminder to those, obviously in the freezing temperatures we're experiencing right now in South Carolina, it's not forefront in people's mind. But as things warm up, as people start taking those boats out, folks, just bear in mind, tragedies like this can happen. And again, let's hope that not only people will be more mindful on the water, but that in the event the unfortunate and tragic does unfold, let's hope that law enforcement can get standardized practices in place to respond to those tragedies. Jen, amazing work on this story. Keep us posted on this bill as it advances.
I will. Thanks, Will.
Maddie, you gonna tell him how Daddy got his black eye?
Yeah.
How'd it happen? Ready, all right.
I'm ready.
All right, we're ready. So that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. I am joined by my number 7, Maddie, and my number 8, Fritzy. And this is one of the witnesses to the playground incident that led to the black eye, but he's not talking. I think he's consulting with his attorneys. But once again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this week's show. And I want to especially thank everybody for their support. Not only does it empower everything we do here to hold folks accountable, but also puts food on the plate for these little ones. And trust me, you guys like to eat, don't you? Yeah, this one. We will catch you next week on the Week in Review.